we are all very lucky to have Dr. Prashant Parikh here, speaker of his stature to take us through for this workshop. He has got 25 years of experience. He is currently the head of the Department of Pathology at Dr. Goenka Dental College, Ahmedabad. He is also associated with Supratech Laboratory as a quality manager and guides them through the NABL and NABH processes. And he's got an active interest in clinical pathology, flow cytometry, immunology. I mean, the list is too long. So, without taking time further, I'll just request Dr. Prashant Parikh to take it. Thank you, sir.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Pratik, for nice words of introduction. I hope I deserve all of them. Many of you must have traveled in the morning. And, I'm going to talk on ANA-related testing with the different technologies, and there would be some comparison between the technologies as well. I'll start with something which is basic, and then move on to some of the very recent guidelines related to ANA testing. Let me thank the APPI Mumbai organizers, MedSource, Ozone, Biomedicals, and all those who are involved in my being here. So I'll start with the topic then. The topic is autoimmune laboratory testing, the role of indirect immunofluorescence in the diagnosis of rheumatic diseases. The term rheumatic diseases is now, is known nowadays as SARD, systemic autoimmune rheumatic diseases. So in my presentation onwards, you will find the reference as SARD, which is basically comprising of many diseases, not a single one. And the SLE is the epitope of that. Okay, and we'll be talking more about that. I actually come from a lab which is NABL and CAB accredited, and I've been doing personally the immunofluorescence for almost 2 decades now. And we have been using HAP2 and HAP2000 substrate very extensively for ANA testing and some other related autoimmune disorders. We usually process around, say, 800 to 1000 samples in a month, comprising of all. The majority of them are ANs, and of course there are a few others like anthras and mitochondrials and smooth muscle, etc. So I'll be talking little. I've been permitted actually, and I thank organizers for the same because the topic is so vast, and I'll start from the basic, and we'll move on to the recent guidelines. Can you all hear me at the back? You are all clear. Okay. So autoimmune. So I'll be talking about first what is autoimmunity. Then there is an overview of laboratory diagnosis of autoimmune disorders, and typically all the different modalities, What are the current aspects of ANA testing, where we compare, the screening methods versus confirmatory, and the conventional methods versus newer methods. Okay. Then there will be some guidelines which have been recently published. Okay, in 2014 and 2015, there are two very good guidelines that have come. Okay, and in fact that has put the confidence back into immunofluorescence. Okay, yeah. The identification of some new patterns which have been given in the guidelines. Automation in ANA testing. Of course, I am also new to that part because we are only doing it. But there are many companies now offering tools, offering solutions for automated ANA testing. And what would be something picture emerging for a new generation immunology lab, where it will have not a single technique, or there will be many multi-pronged approach with many technologies to ultimately come to a conclusion and arrive at a diagnosis. And then at the end there will be some summary, okay, of the presentation with references. In the 20th century, Paul Ehrlich, he used the word horror autotoxicus. Okay, so that was the one which was coined by Paul Ehrlich, and that literally means the loss of self-tolerance, which leads to autoimmune disorder, tissue damage. And there are there are some mechanisms which underlie the autoimmunity and tissue damage. We all know that the clonal energy, clonal elimination, and the role of suppressor T cells, cytotoxic T cells. Okay, they come into play to lead to tissue damage. To diagnose any autoimmune disorder, we have to have three criteria met. And these three criteria are: number one, the presence of an immune reaction. That means there is an antigen-antibody reaction. Antibodies are directed against self-antigen, and this is very specific. Okay, yeah. Number two, there is evidence that such reaction is not secondary to tissue damage. Actually, so it is not secondary to the tissue damage occurring because of some other reason. Okay, it must be the primary reason of tissue damage. So that is number two criteria. And number three is that there is no other cause of that tissue damage. So if we meet these three, then a diagnosis of autoimmune disorder can be done. Okay, so these are the three basic criteria. The first one, the lab diagnostics, basically they are directed against the first one, where we try and establish the immune reaction, typically with the help of testing for many autoantibodies. Okay. The autoimmune disorders, we all know, they are systemic, involving many systems of the body, or it could be organ specific, like thyroid, GIT, kidney. So they are of two types basically. The autoimmune disorders have impacted the public health very significantly, and the reasons are that they are very challenging for diagnosis and treatment, and very difficult to cure. Probably you never cure autoimmune disorder, you can only control it. And it involves a lot of cost also. So that is again another part of its impact on the public health. And it impairs the quality of the life, typically one which is a working population of the society. Okay, so the one which is less than 65 years of age is also affected. A typical autoimmune laboratory diagnosis or diagnosis of an autoimmune disorder involves again a plenty of tests. They are grouped into 6 types, what you see on the left hand side of this slide. Okay, it involves basic initial workup, and it is followed by a sophisticated testing later on. Of course, it is not required in all cases. Only few cases require a sophisticated kind of. So first 3 types of laboratory testing, that is the initial inflammatory marker and autoantibodies, they actually are the, they form the majority of the work which is being done in the investigation of autoimmune disorders. The rest three, that is flow cytometry, cytokines, and HLA typing, usually they are, they are selectively taken up as per the case. The initial workup actually is, directed towards establishing whether there is an inflammation. Okay, so tissue inflammation is established with the initial two things, that is initial lab work, which involves blood counts, urinalysis. Now, urinalysis is for basically, to see the damage to the glomeruli, okay, and in terms of proteinuria. Coagulation system, because many of the coagulation parameters are affected in autoimmune disorders, typically antiphospholipid syndrome, APS. Okay, so where we see derangement of the PT and APTT. Then calcium, routine chemistries, and enzymes. Enzymes are important, and enzymes are important for certain group of autoimmune disorders like polymyositis or dermatomyositis or those involving liver. Inflammatory markers, organ-specific autoimmune disorders, or when there are secondary damage to the related organs. Autoantibodies and immunological studies, which is the mainstay of diagnosis, and where the efforts are usually done to establish the presence of antibody and its status. And basically there are several types of autoantibodies which are being tested. Rheumatoid arthritis, that is RA factor, and anti-CCP for rheumatoid arthritis. Then ANA and some other related tests like dsDNA, ENA, and even some of the myositis markers, they are also available. They can be used for SLE and other related disorders. ANCAs are basically done for vasculitis, and of course the complement is also used, the complement factors C3, C4, and immunoglobulins and cryoglobulins. Usually they are not done routinely, but as per the need, it can be used. Lupus anticoagulant, anticardiolipin antibodies, and other related antibodies can also be done as per the need. So that autoantibody comprises of the major chunk of autoimmune lab testing. Flow cytometry, cytokines, and HLA typing. HLA typing is basically done for risk stratification, because there is a strong association of certain HLA loci with certain diseases, and to establish that the prediction of a risk, particularly in family members, the HLA typing is done. One of the classical we all know is HLA-B27 for ankylosing spondylitis. The autoimmune laboratory test would be of two types, typically represented by AN. Okay, and these two types of test would be either a screening test, which should have a very high sensitivity, almost 100%, and the other type of test would be a confirmatory, which is having a very high specificity, almost reaching 100%. If I have to I have to classify the ANA related testing into these two categories, then what you see just in the lower part of the slide, the different techniques, immunofluorescence and multiplexing. These are the two which can be used as screening, because they screen for a variety of autoantibodies. So they are used typically for screening, whereas the line immunoassays, that is blot, previously we used to call it as blot, ANA blot, and ELISA, they are used for confirmation. Now, ANA test comprises, or ANA test is the hallmark, and which is one of the most commonly requested tests in immunology laboratory. All those who are doing ANA or immunology work must be knowing this, that 60, 70, 80% of the bulk is ANA, and that is on the rise. Okay, because if you see year on year, there is always an increase in the number of interest also. So it is one of the mainstay of autoimmune laboratory testing, and it has changed its methodology over a period of time also. So now it all started with ANA on animal tissue some 50, 60, 70 years back, and now has been moved on to automated platforms, and even the hybridoma technique where we have a cell lines defined, very well defined cell lines available, and from there to even multiplexing where we are using the same thing, the extract of those cells, have two cells which are coated on a base, and that is how the methodology of ANA testing has changed, but still has remained the gold standard. That is the basic beauty of that particular test. The conventional methods for ANA testing are the LE cell preparation, which is of course obsolete, and I think no lab in the world now probably doing this. Okay, indirect immunofluorescence, then ELISA, line immunoassays, and there are some others which are less popular with the Luminex platform, and the antigen microarray. Now, in spite of all these technologies available in the recent times, the IF remains the gold standard. Okay, and its position has been again strengthened, probably re-established by the position statement from ACR, which was released in 2009, and it says the ANA by IF still should continue as gold standard. Okay, so that is the position statement of American College of Rheumatology 2009. Now, if we analyze the prevalence of different technologies for ANA testing, then we have a picture which is emerging is something like this. Immunofluorescence, again, still very popular method. More than around 65% of the labs all around the world doing the same method. Okay, and it is the gold standard as the ACR recommendation. ELISA, around 25% of the labs are doing ELISAs, and of course the number of assays would be more because overall it is 25%, but if you individually pick up the assays, then it would be more than 40% of the total bulk. Increasing number of labs are performing now multiplexing, and which is around 10%. Multiplexing is done on Luminex or flow cytometry, as I say. And the final one is microarray, which is the latest, but still under research use only. So it is not for the diagnostics at the moment, not marketed for diagnosis. A typical flow chart of ANA testing usually would have this kind of a flow. Okay, initially there is a screening which is done by immunofluorescence, and then depending upon the title and depending upon the pattern, I think it is followed by some kind of a confirmatory test, maybe ELISA, maybe line immunoassay, or maybe some other kind of a technique. Okay, and usually ELISAs are available for 2-3 main groups of antigens. One is called extractable nuclear antigen, ENA, and ENA basically comprises of 6 different antigens to which the antibodies can be detected. The second one is anti-TSDN, which is again available on ELISA, as well as there are many other methods also, like FAR assay, which is based on radioimmunoassay, and CLIFT, which is based upon the immunofluorescence. Now, if we go into little finer detail of ANA testing by immunofluorescence, then this is the basics of it. What we do is, it is basically an immunological reaction, antigen-antibody reaction. We take serum of the patient which contains autoantibodies, and it is mixed with, or it is rather poured onto a slide which contains cells, and those cells are expressing different antigens. Those antigens may be from nucleus, from cytoplasm, from nucleoli, or some other elements of the cell, okay, to which the antibodies could be directed. So there will be an antigen-antibody reaction which is taking place on the substrate cell, which are there on the slide, okay. And then the antibodies, excess of antibodies are washed out, and then there is a second antibody which is added, which is tagged with fluorochrome, and which will give a fluorescence under the UV light. So whenever it is positive, there is a reaction, it will give you a fluorescence, and this fluorescence is detected by, as you can see, by the fluorescent microscope. An image can be also captured, okay. Now that is possible with the latest automation techniques. The slides or the substrate which is used for ANA testing by immunofluorescence. Nowadays we have two types of cells. Okay. One is called HAP2, which is a precursor form of what is used nowadays, which is HAP2 2000. There is a little difference between HAP2 and HAP 2000. So it all started with HAP2, which is a hybridoma cell line, okay, and where there is a monolayer of this HAP2 amount of SSA antigen. So the basic limitation of HAP2 was that it used to fail to detect SSA antibody, and that has been overcome by HAP 2000, because HAP 2000 expresses, rather overexpresses SSA antigen, and because of that it can pick up those antibodies very well. Okay, so HAP 2000 at the moment is the gold standard, and it is recommended by even CLSI as well as CAP. Now what you see in the picture is a typical HAP2 cell, which is a very large cell with a very large nucleus and having all the cellular elements. So if there is an antibody directed against any of them, it will easily pick up. I mean, it can pick up. Okay. And what you see on a slide is a absolutely monolayer. There is no overlapping, hardly any overlapping is there. Now preparation of this HAP2 cell is very important, and it has to have two types of cells. One is called interface cells, which are steady cells, okay, quiescent cells, which are having a round nucleus, okay, as you can see in the other picture, okay, and the one which is known as mitotic cell, okay. So there are two types of populations of HAP2 cells or HAP 2000 cells on the slide, ideally. 80 to 90% should be interface, which are having a round nucleus, and 10 to 20% would be a mitotic cell. Now the purpose of including mitotic cell is to pick up those rare antigens which appear during mitosis. Okay, so those which are mitosis related antigens can be picked up by those cells. Okay, so a ideal HAP2 cell preparation or slide would have both the populations, and there is a criteria again. 10 to 15% of the mitotic cell is the bottom line. Okay, so a good preparation would have both of them. And this is some more details on HAP2 and HAP 2000 cells. As I said, okay, the basic limitation of HAP2 cells is the failure to detect SSA antibodies. Okay, and which can happen up around 10% of the cases. Okay. HAP 2000 is overcoming that this limitation, and that is because they are genetically engineered with a hyper expression of SSA antigen, so that it will pick up that antibody very well. Immunofluorescence remains the gold standard for ANA testing, okay, and it is the method of choice, as we saw that even in the previous slide. 65% of the labs are still doing ANA by IF method. It has got a very high sensitivity of detection, okay, and that is one of the basic advantage. Although there are many limitations that we will see later on, okay. But the high sensitivity of detection is one of the biggest advantage. The literal meaning of that is that if the test is negative, it virtually rules out the autoimmune disorder. Okay, and this is the main theme for which the clinicians are requesting. The popularity has increased because you want to exclude a group of disorder that is autoimmune, and you ask for ANA test. If it is negative, you take out that particular group of disorders from your diagnosis. Okay, so that is how it has been, now getting more and more popular, as we will see that later on also. Now, why it has remained the method of choice? The basic thing is that it is like an array, okay, similar to a microarray, where you have plenty of things available, okay, on the solid phase in form of a cell sheet, okay, and it offers you more than 100 different antigens at a time. Okay, so whenever there is an antibody against any of this, it will give you a positive reaction, positive test. Okay, so that is the biggest advantage. You can test so many antibodies in a single run. Okay, it is similar to something like an array. And another advantage nowadays is again the automation which has come into play. Automation. Now you can have something which is captured, and you have a figure. Image. Image can be analyzed. Image can be analyzed by software initially. Later on, some expert will also analyze the same thing. So that is the biggest advantage now that we have on immunofluorescence. Okay. As I said, the ANA by immunofluorescence has gained so much of popularity in last 50-60 years. What you can see, I'm sorry, I think the arrow is not. Initially, when it was started, the ANA test was only limited to rheumatology and clinical immunology. Okay, the clinicians of these two specialty would request ANA. Now, over a period of time, okay, so many medical specialties and disciplines, they all are, requesting ANA testing. So it has gained a lot of popularity. But along with that, the pre-test probability has decreased, because most of the time the request is to exclude the autoimmune disorders. Okay, so to begin with, the testing is done to exclude, and that is why the pre-test probability, okay, is it has decreased over a period of time. So what you see is a triangle or a wedge which is showing the pre-test probability, which is decreasing over a period of time. Okay, so one of the very good pictures which I have taken from some of the recent articles, okay, which I referred at the end of the presentation. You can always access that. They are all free download available. Okay, so they are. So that is about the popularity of ANA. Now, when we do ANA testing, what is important is the interpretation, and here interpretation is done by a trained person. Okay, so at the moment we are not talking about the automated IFF. Okay, so interpretation involves two things. Number one, the intensity of staining. So you have to the moment you see in the slide, you have to see the intensity, and you compare the intensity with the cutoff intensity. We call it as endpoint intensity. If it is higher than that, that means the test is likely to be positive. Okay. The second thing which we see is the staining pattern. Okay, which are the components of the cell which are primarily stained. Okay, whether it is nucleus, whether it is cytoplasm, whether it is nucleoli or something else. Okay, and what kind of cells which are stained, whether interphase cells are stained or mitotic cells are stained. So this is how we interpret the basic ANA by immunofluorescence. Now, once we have a positive test, okay, once we conclude by looking at the slides that the test is positive, then we have to go further. Okay, and when we go further with the serum dilution, dilution of the serum in a serial way to reach the end point. Okay, so that is number one. And number two, we predict the antigen specificity. Okay, now from the pattern of the immunofluorescence, we come to know what kind of antigen could probably be involved. Okay, so there is always a kind of antigen specificity which is being predicted, and for which some confirmatory test is done. Okay, so second important point which we do as a follow-up of the positive ANA test is the antigen specificity and its confirmation by anything which is available in the lab. Okay, either in form of a the line immunoassay or ELISA or something else. Okay, so all can be all that should be done. The results are reported typically with screening titer. So if a lab is doing only one titer, then you report with a titer, screening titer, and in that case you have to specify the intensity of positivity. Okay. Now when you are doing a serial dilution and you go up to the end point, then in that case you straight away report titer. There is no need to report the intensity. Okay. So reporting is done either with the screening titer or testing. Okay, disease associations, the probable false positive tests rate, that all should be there in a typical lab report of ANA testing by immunofluorescence. Okay. Now when the test is positive, it can give you an idea about any of the autoimmune disorder depending upon the titer and the pattern. Okay. In general, the ANA by IF method is very, very sensitive, as I said before, and the sensitivity varies with different diseases. The sensitivity is probably highest for mixed connective tissue disorder, which is almost more than 95%. Okay, where the RNPs are detected, producing a speckle kind of a pattern. The second one is SLE. The sensitivity for SLE, okay, is around 90%, you may say, okay, with a positive ANA test by immunofluorescence. And others will have a little lower kind of sensitivity. The interpretation of ANA depends on the pre-test probability of the test, okay, which is very, very important. So if you have two patients, one which is absolutely normal and you want to exclude something, autoimmune disorder, because of some family history or something, and you have another patient where you have many features of SLE as per the ACR guidelines. Now when you are doing a test of ANA on both these two patients, your pre-test probabilities are different, okay, and accordingly the test will be interpreted. Okay, say for example, even with the second one where there are classical symptoms of presentation of SLE, even the low titer could be very, very specific, okay, could be diagnostic. While in case of the other one where there are no other symptoms and the test is positive, you would still be, you will not buy it. So you will see it with a doubt and you will try and repeat it after some time, you will confirm with some other technique, okay. So the interpretation of ANA depends very much on the pre-test probability, and in certain settings where there is a high index of clinical suspicion, even the low titer could be also diagnostic. Okay, so that we have to remember. The higher the titer, the more likely the ANA test is clinically significant, and in patients with disease, the higher titers usually suggest very active disease. Okay, so these are some very basic interpretive comments for ANIF in terms of autoimmune disorders. Now, having seen something very basic about the ANA-IF, now let's see what limitations and why there was a time in between there was a lot of noise against ANA and some alternative technologies were getting so popular, okay, and what were the limitations? The limitations are Number one, it is time consuming. The turnaround time would be longer. So that is again one. In terms of clinical management, it is little minus. Okay. Second, it involves a lot of subjectivity. The person who is interpreting has to be trained properly. Not only the one who is interpreting, one who is requesting also. Okay, so clinicians also must have a very clear background of what they are requesting and out of what clinical context they are requesting. Okay, so that has to be the clinicians also, the one who is requesting, one who is performing, one who is interpreting the reports, all should be very trained because it is involving a lot of subjectivity. Another area of limitation is the discrepancy, discrepant results between the methods and between the laboratories. Now when I say methods, the method is, that is IF against other methods. Okay, and that is because it's a very common scenario that you see IF positive and it is not confirmed on LIA. Okay, so line immunoassay is totally negative and you will end up into a kind of a confusion. Okay, so the discrepant results are basically because of low sensitivity of certain antibodies. Now overall sensitivity is very high, but for certain antibodies, certain specific against certain specific line immunoassay positive or ELISA positive, and the suspected antibodies could be the SSA, as I said, if you are using HEP2, it is JAW1, ribosomal P protein, and even RO52. Now RO52 is generally indicated during pregnancy, and usually it is indicative of a condition called congenital heart block in the newborn. Okay, and for that risk, if somebody has to assess, then I think RO52 is one component of SSA. SSA has got two components, one is RO60 and the other one is RO52. Okay, so here the test must be specific for RO52. Okay, so that also could be negative. So low specificity for certain antibodies can lead to a discrepant results between methods or between labs. Another problem is that the positivity, false positive, or you may say the IF is positive and the other things are negative. Okay, and that commonly occurs with the pattern of Specker, nucleolar, or maybe the test which you are using for confirmation has limited number of antigens on it. Okay, as I said, IF would screen for more than 100 antigens, but your ELISA would have a very limited number of antigens targeted. Okay, so LIA again very few number of antigens targeted. So if the antibody is against anything which is other than those antigens, then you might get a negative result on confirmatory test. Okay, so that is another reason for discrepant test. And third one is that there is no confirmation for certain patterns. There are certain patterns where we cannot do anything. Okay, like cytoplasmic or some mitotic. Okay, so where you simply have IF positive, there is no other test available which can confirm that. Okay, so that is a real problem with the IF method. Another issue is discordant results. Discordant result means the disagreement between the clinical and the lab test. Okay, so clinicians not suspecting anything, he has just requested to exclude the result, but you come out with a positive test and he is surprised. Okay, so now this happens typically with this particular phenomenon. Okay, many of the antibodies, they appear well before the clinical onset of the disease. Okay, so what you see here, this is the clinical onset, because when antibodies is rising to certain level, then it will manifest. Before that, antibody is simply present, there are no clinical manifestations. So if the test is done during this period of time, okay, clinician would be naturally surprised, because you are giving a positive test and he is not probably expecting. So this is one of the very important reason of what is a discordant results. The second one is the false positive. ANA gives you false positive depending upon the titer that you use. Okay. Initially, the recommendation was to do two titers, 1:40 and 1:160. Okay. Now the consensus is of doing 1:160 only. Okay. And when you do only 160, you are cutting down the false positive to just 5%. Okay. So if you are doing a less dilution, you get more number of false positive. Okay. So that was a real problem, and for which the other technologies were, people explored for other technologies because there was everything coming positive, and that was the issue. Another limitation which is not shown in the presentation is the mix pattern. Okay, one of the limitation of mix pattern. If a lab is doing only one titer, one dilution pattern, screening dilution, then many times the mix patterns are not reported adequately. Okay, whichever is the predominant pattern is being reported. Because SLE has usually SLE patients will have more than 3 antibodies usually when the disease is active, and if it is dsDNA which is predominant, then you will get a homogeneous pattern. You are going to report it as homogeneous, and you miss out the other ones like SM or RNB. Okay, and that will only be detected when you do LIF. Okay, so another issue with ANA by IF is the reporting of the mixed pattern. Okay, so and that is the reason I think a lab should do always the dilution whenever there is a positive, and because dilution will give you a clear-cut idea between two patterns. Okay, so the dilution is the only way where you can differentiate two patterns, and that is how you can pick up the antigen specificities. Just to sum up the ANA testing for different diseases. Okay, a very good chart taken from one of the recent articles of 2014. Okay, and what you see here is diseases, its clinical utility. I mean, clinical utility of ANA, the prevalence, and whether it is can be used for prognosis or monitoring. Now, for most of the tests, it cannot be used. Okay, the general statement would be that ANA cannot be used for monitoring or prognosis of the disease. I think as we move on, I think I will elaborate more on that. Okay. Drifting little away from ANA for a while, and let's talk something which is again very common in clinical practice, in lab practice, that is rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, and we have a new test which has been there for almost now a decade, that is anti-CCP, okay, which is again an antibody against cyclic citrullinated peptides. Okay, a very powerful diagnostic test in rheumatoid arthritis patients, where other markers could be negative, like RF negative, or even anti-keratin antibodies are negative. Of course, AKA are not very popularly available, not easily available. But if somebody has done that, it would also it can confirm the patient where it is negative. The sensitivity of anti-CCP, it varies in the as per the stage of RA, and usually it is very, very important to diagnose early RA. One of the biggest advantage of using anti-CCP over RA is early diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, where the sensitivity is of course 50%, but can still pick up many of the cases. And as the disease progresses, the sensitivity also increases, and the specificity is very good. So whenever RA has got, it is not very specific because it can be present in many other diseases or even in old age. The CCP is very, very specific. Okay. It is used for diagnosis in certain scenarios like clinical suspicion of RA, early undifferentiated inflammatory arthritis, and to distinguish rheumatoid arthritis from other RF positive arthritis. There are many other arthritis which are not RA but still positive for RA factor, and where you have to confirm by anti-CCP. It is again not used like ANN for monitoring. One of the important thing about the CCP is this, and RA used to be a criteria for rheumatoid arthritis as per the ACR, and when it was involved, only RA was involved, there was a lot of problem. Okay, because relying on ACR criteria for RA, which includes only RF factor, it leads to a very late diagnosis. Okay, so the revised criteria of ACR has now included anti-CCP also. So anti-CCP can pick up early RA, and that is what has been significantly changed in the recent times. Okay, there are several types of CCP assays available. First generation, second generation, third generation. Now what we have is third generation. Now let's talk something about what has come recently in ANA testing by immunofluorescence. There are two publications which have been released in last couple of years. The one is the international recommendation for assessment of antibodies, autoantibodies. Very significant change has come into the nomenclature. Okay, now ANA term is outdated. Okay, it is obsolete, and it is replaced by cellular antibodies. Okay, because not only that we detect antibodies against the nuclei, but there are other components which are also targeted and where antibodies can be detected against them. And that is why ANA and ENA, these two terms are obsolete. They are no longer recommended. Instead, they have been replaced by cellular antibodies. Okay. And the second one is the nomenclature about different patterns. There has to be a kind of a consensus world over regarding the reporting, regarding rather identification of a pattern. Okay, somebody in this part of the world would say it is speckled, and when you go to some other part, he will say it is something different. Okay, so that nomenclature has to be, there has to be a consensus as far as the nomenclature is concerned, and this is the first of its type. This is the very, very good article, and which is describing around 28 different patterns. They have been defined and they have been described in detail. Okay. Now let's talk about the first one, that is International Recommendation of 2014, which was basically revised by two expert committees, and one from Europe and the other from the non-European countries. Okay, one which is known as EASI, okay, European Autoimmunity Standardization Initiative. So there is one group of people, okay, representing 15 different European countries, and that included not only the clinicians, the technocrats, and even the pathologists also. So there was a group called EASY, okay, European, and the other one was International Union of Immunology Societies, which was represented by ACR, WHO, CDC, and Arthritis Foundation. So these two committees, or these two group of people, they came together and they recommended certain points, and this has been published as a part of this publication, and this is the process how it was devised. Okay, now when they came together in the third step, there were 25 recommendations which were given, and these 25 recommendations were voted by individual member of these two groups. So all individuals representing that group, they voted for those recommendations. And from that recommendation, which were voted with the numeric figure from 0 to 10, if somebody strongly recommends that particular recommendation, then he will give a score of 10. And he is not at all recommending, then it will be a score of 0. They compiled all the scores of all the group members, and then it was expressed as what is known as the Delphi Delphi score. And there were only 2 recommendations out of 25 where Delphi score was very low, showing disagreement between the members. Otherwise, all 23 had a strong recommendation and agreement from all the members. Okay, so this is how it was done. So the point is that these recommendations are represented by many people all around the world working in this particular field. There are, as I said, there are 25 recommendations, and one of the very important one which they recommended is to exclude or to discontinue the terminology ANA as well as ENA, and it has to be replaced by the antibodies to cellular antigens. They are quite easy to understand, and I'll just read it out and whenever required, I think I'll try and explain. The first recommendation is the diagnosis of autoimmune rheumatic disease requires a panel of laboratory tests. It is not dependent on a single test like ANIF. Okay, you have to have many tests together to come to a diagnosis. Okay, so ANA, anti-dsDNA, and anti-VNA, extractable nuclear antigen, which comprises of 6 antigens, typically giving a speckle pattern. Okay, whenever you see ANA with a speckle pattern, your target is ENA. When you are doing ANA and you are seeing a homogeneous pattern, your target is DNA first. And if DNA is negative, then you go for others like histone or something else. Okay, so like that, 3 tests initially should be considered for diagnosis, not a single test. Okay, so number 1, number 2. Number 3, the detection of ANA is the first level of test for laboratory diagnosis. It is the screening test. It is not confirmatory. Your testing starts from there. It should never end over there. Okay, so it should not be limited to up to that. So detection of ANA is the first level of laboratory testing, typically a screening test. ANA testing is primarily intended for diagnostic purposes. As we could see in that particular table, they are never used for prognosis as well as for monitoring. IF is the reference method for ANA screening, and whenever it is used, you have to keep in mind the false positive and false negatives. False positive depending upon the titer, and false negative depending upon the antigen specificities. Okay. Whenever it is done by lab, the lab report must specify the technique which is being used. Okay, so 6th recommendation is that the lab should specify the methods which is used for ANA testing. Tests based on a restrictive mixture like ELISA, where we have very few antigen specificities targeted, or multiplexing, again very few. Okay, they should never be labeled as ANA. Okay, so they should not be referred to as ANA test. Okay, so they should not be. ANA is only one, that is IF, which is using cell substrate, either HAP2 or HAP2000. Laboratory using in-house assay. If there is indigenous test which a lab has developed, then it must undergo a validation as per the international guidelines like WHO, CDC, etc. Okay, so you have to validate your test if you are doing your own test. Okay, and finally, the fluorochrome labeled anti-human immunoglobulin (IgG) specific antibodies must be used. Okay, so it must be of human nature, human origin rather, sorry. Okay, so when you are using conjugate, it must have the anti-human immunoglobulin specific antibodies. The screening dilution should be defined. Okay, usually, as I say, nowadays the consensus is for 1:160 if you are using only one dilution, and if you are going for a serial dilution for all that are positive, then it should be a serial dilution. But the initial dilution must be 1:160. The prior concept of 1:40 and 1:160 is now no longer used. However, many of the manufacturers still don't follow the guideline of 1:160. 1:100 is being used by most of the labs, or most of the manufacturers also recommend the same. Okay, yeah. So 1:100, because whatever has been recommended or instructed by the manufacturer, I think the lab must follow. So if it is 1:100, then I think you have to do 1:100. If there is no instruction, no recommendation from manufacturer, in that case you can go for 1:160 as recommended by the current recommendation. For a positive test, the pattern and highest dilution to be reported. Okay. Cytoplasmic and mitotic patterns should be also reported. Okay, not only restricted to nuclear, all other elements where you find antibodies, you have to report. Then for anti-dsDNA, the FAR assay, which is radioimmunoassay, and CLIFT, which is based on immunofluorescence, they are actually the gold standard for confirmation. Okay, and that is for diagnosis. For monitoring of the disease, CLIFT can never be used. Okay, so CLIFT, which is based on immunofluorescence, can never be used. You can use FAR assay even for monitoring of the disease, and you can use even ELISA also. Okay, so that is for DNA. The test method you have to mention whenever you are doing anti-dsDNA test separately, whether you are following ELISA, whether you are doing FAR assay, or whether you are doing that CLIFT. Okay, using Cliteria lucid, okay, immunofluorescence. For monitoring, as I said, quantitatively it can only be done with FAR assay and ELISA, not with the CLIFT. Okay. Whenever you have a speckled pattern on IF and you are doing a follow-up DNA testing, then in that case again you have to mention the method. Okay, so that is again one recommendation. You can see that is number 20. 21st is it should be reported separately. Okay, whenever you are doing a separate test, it should not be a part of an IF report. It should be reported separately. Okay. And whenever the mixed connective tissue disorder is suspected, you have to do a testing for RNP, which is again a separate testing. Okay. So when clinical suspicion is for MCTD, then you have to go for RNP testing by ELISA or some other equivalent testing. Equivalent method. And very, very important is the definition of cutoff. The report must include the cutoff of every lab, okay, of the individual lab. And cutoff is, is to differentiate a true positive from a negative, okay. So that is what has to be defined. So for example, if you are doing 1:160 dilution as a screening dilution, and you are doing only one dilution, then the intensity of one probably is not very significant. Okay, so then in that case you have to put your cutoff as intensity of 2 or more at 1:160 is significant. Should I repeat it? Yeah. Say for example, if you are doing one dilution of 1:100 or 1:160 and you are getting intensity of 1. Okay, now the intensity of 1 is just borderline. Okay, can be false positive. Okay, can occur with so many things. And in that case, you have to put your cutoff something upon validation that intensity 1, okay, on the screening titer or screening dilution is probably not significant, could represent even a false positive. Okay, anything which is more than 2, 3 or 4 intensity is significant, and it has to be followed up by a confirmatory test. Okay, so that kind of a cutoff you have to put in your reports. Okay. The second one is regarding the consensus. There was a international workshop under what is known as ICAP, International Consensus of Anti-Nuclear Antibody Pattern, which was held in Brazil in 2014. And upon the convention, the objective was to facilitate and encourage the use of standardized nomenclature for different patterns on HAP2, okay, and to optimize its use for the clinical management. Prefix called AC, A anti-cell. Okay, so there is a prefix of AC followed by a numeric number. There is a numeric figure. Okay, so AC1 to AC28, these are the 28 different patterns that were described during this particular convention, and they are all available on the website of anapatterns.org. Okay. If I have to say something about those patterns, this is the chart which will say everything. There are all 28 patterns described over here. Now what you see is a reporting level. Okay, so there are few which are in orange color, there are few in green color. Okay, so orange color means one who is competent, okay, but not the expert. The green can only be described, can be reported by only expert. Okay, so this is what the recommendation is. And what you see here, another legend, this is for mitosis cells. Okay, so this one, whenever you see this particular one, then this is related to the mitosis. Okay, so you have to see that particular pattern in mitotic cells only. Okay, yeah. So there are three major types: nuclear, cytoplasmic, and mitotic. Nuclear one is from 1 to 40, cytoplasmic 15 to 23, and mitotic from 24 to 28. Okay, they have been very, very clearly defined. There are good pictures included in this particular, like this. So what you see, the homogeneous here. Okay, what you see again, centromere here, nucleolar, spectral, and then you have cytoplasmic. Okay, and what you have is a Golgi. This is dots, cytoplasmic dots actually, and this is Golgi. Yeah. So these are the different patterns which have been described and defined in this particular one. The current guidelines, the recent guidelines rather, they suggest that there has to be an attempt to report cytoplasmic patterns. Okay, so whenever you find ANA negative, but there are some other elements being targeted, then you report them. One of them could be cytoplasmic. Okay, and there are a variety of cytoplasmic. The irony of the fact is that many of these cytoplasmics do not have confirmatory test. You cannot confirm them. Okay, so that is the problem. But just to encourage reporting cytoplasmic, probably in the time to come we might have confirmatory test available for many of them, and that is why the recommendation is to report them also. Okay. Some of the newer patterns which have been described over a period of time, I'll cover very quickly. One is MND, that is multiple nuclear dots. Okay, this is how it looks. Okay, and there are 15 to 30 speckles in a cell, typically in a nucleus, and usually associated with PECs. Okay. Yeah. The second one is called mid body. Okay. The hallmark to identify is this, that between two cells, okay, the cleavage is still, okay, between two dividing cells, and that is how you pick up the mid body. Again, clinical significance is not known actually, but many presume that it is probably a early predictor of evolving rheumatic disease. The third one, which is recently described, is called DFS. Okay, so DFS 70, and again it resembles. It is basically a combination of what you can say a speckled with homogeneous. Okay, so what you see in an interphase nuclei, the speckled pattern, but if you see the mitotic, then you see a kind of a solid stain. Okay, so solid staining, which is seen in case of homogenes, something like homogenes. So this is a combination of what you can say a homogeneous as well as speckled. The significance again remains not so defined. It is said that most of the patients or persons rather having this particular pattern, their has got no significance, but there is a persistence of the pattern over a period of time. Then another one is GW bodies, and GW bodies have been it is described as again described in the cytoplasm. There are speckling, and this speckling is seen in a variety of disorders. Again, not very specific to any one of them. Yeah.
Are you going to take questions now or later?
Yeah.
Sure.
There will be session.
Okay. So a specific question now.
Yes.
Sure. Then there are mitotic spindle antibodies. Okay, and the recent guidelines also describe about the separate testing. Till some time back, the idea was that if you do ANA testing alone, it would it would rule out everything if it is negative. Now that is not the case. Okay, so separate testing is recommended for certain typical indications, and one of the indication is as we have seen before, whenever you are dealing with antibodies against SSA, RO, JAW1 and ribosomal P, then you have to recommend and you have to do additional testing for this also. Okay, and clinicians would decide upon this particular thing. Okay. The second one is dsDNA, as I said, and dsDNA testing for whether it is confirmation or for monitoring. Then again you have to choose appropriate test. And the third one is related to pregnancy, where RO52 antibodies are very, very specific for congenital CHP, congenital heart block in newborn, and that has to be targeted. So these are the three typical recommendations which are over and above ANS screening. Okay. Let's talk about in brief about some other techniques. One is 9 immunoassay, very popular, mostly used for confirmation of ANA, initial ANA positive screen. Okay, and the advantage is that again it has got very high specificity and sensitivity. There are many 9 immunoassays available, and as Matt Source has one which is having 17 different antigens targeted, and they have been grouped as per the disease. So what you see, I think they have been grouped. So initial 6 is for SLE, something like that. So they have been grouped, and you can interpret in terms of disease also, not only as positive, negative, but also diagnosis of a particular disease. So that is 9 immunoassay. The advantage is that the the rapid turnaround time, okay? And second one is there is no subjectivity, the most objective results that you get. And another advantage is that it has got the automation is also available. Now you have, reflectance photometry available, which can read your streak and can give you the results. Okay, so semi-computation is also available, and a lot of automation, objectivity into reporting. Okay. The only disadvantage is that the protein antigens, which are fixed onto the strip, they undergo some kind of a denaturation and may not react well with the antibodies. Okay, so it will give either there will be erratic kind of behavior of antibody to those kind of antigens. Okay, either that could be a lower reactivity or that could be even cross reactivity also. Okay, so that could be one of the things you have to keep in mind when you are using alignment. And the one which is marketed by MatchSource. So this is representing SLE. This is representing, which one is that? Jaw lens. Yeah. Okay. Then this is Raynaud's, and the last one is myositis. Okay. So this is how they are grouped, and there are some others also available. Okay. So one which is with 12 antigens, the other one is with 25 antigens. Okay. So they are also, I think, diasortin is marketed. They are positive for dsDNA, nucleosomes, SM, pCNA, and ribosomal preprotein. Okay, so likewise you can always have a profile available on arrival, so it helps in the diagnosis also. ELISA is used for confirmatory tests, and usually done for either dsDNA or for DNA. Okay, and the advantage is that you can do a quantitation on ELISA. That is possible. So monitoring of a target antibody is possible with ELISA. Okay, that is the basic advantage. And the disadvantage is that many times there is a contamination, typically for dsDNA. Okay, so there is a contamination with single-stranded DNA, and that can interfere with your results. And it detects only one antibody at a time. Okay, multiplexing is not possible in case of ELISA. Okay, and if it is possible, it will not tell you which particular antibody is there. It will say only positive. Okay, so that is the disadvantage of ELISA. Yeah. Now compared to ELISA, multiplexing gives both the things. It will tell you the antibody and it will quantitate also. Okay, so that is the advantage of multiplexing. Multiplexing uses the beads, and these beads are of different colors. Okay, so different colors of beads tagged with different antigens, and these antigens are either derived from HEP2 cells extract. Okay, so extract of HEP2 cells taken, and the beads are coated with them, and when the antigen-antibody reaction takes place and when you run through the flow cell, okay, first laser comes which will identify the bead. So from identification of a bead with the first laser, the antibody is identified, and with the second laser it will rather quantitate the antibody. So first is which antibody, second one quantitation. Okay, so multiplexing, very, very promising, and again no subjectivity, okay, like what we have in case of IF. Automated platform is available, shorter turnaround time, these are the clear advantages, and multiple antibodies can be detected with with a good form of, no subjective error of interpretation, and false negative typically when you have a limited number of antigens. Okay, so when your antibody is directed against something which is not there, then I think that is the imputation where you get a false negative result. And the recombinant antigens sometimes they behave, in a strange way in terms of reactivity. Microarray is still in the research mode only, okay, and not used for diagnostics at the moment. So I think we will not go into details. Automated IF. The automated IF is one of the, just to overcome the subjectivity which was involved in when you are doing it manually and interpreting the slides upon microscopic examination. And that to overcome that automation, the concept of automation has come. It involves three things. One is the staining station, which is totally automated. All dilutions are done, all mixing, incubation.